Okay, I think I'll get started just because I have to sort of beat the weather out of here, but we're going to talk about biofuels. So that was a great segue into what I'm going to talk about. So I just wanted to say thank you to the editors of the North Dakota Law Review for inviting me here. And thank you to you all for being here on a Friday afternoon. I'm thankful it's not as nice as it was yesterday, so you all have a reason to be in here. But a little bit about myself. I teach environmental and renewable energy law at the University of Illinois within the College of Ag. So I'm not embedded in the College of Law, although I teach some classes over there once in a while. I'm in a College of Agriculture, so I'm actually doubly happy to be here today among lawyers because I don't often get the chance to sort of work with lawyers or law professors. Like I said, I teach environmental law, renewable energy law, natural resources policy to undergraduates and graduates who are studying all sorts of things in agriculture, economics, ecology, animal sciences. Because at our College of Ag at the University of Illinois, we really sort of believe in training our scientists to have, some sort of core capacity in law and policy, because those are the folks out there that are really, making the difference in the ground in terms of ensuring that we have science-based policy. But I also have a dual appointment at what is called the Energy Biosciences Institute. It was founded in 2007 through a $500 million grant from BP to the University of Illinois and California, Berkeley, with the sole sort of goal of figuring out how to commercialize cellulosic biofuels. So we're at our 5-year mark, and we've had some interesting developments in part of what I'm going to talk about today, which is the importance of land use, and I'm going to be talking about the biofuels case. Why the biofuels case? And I think we have to start back in the early 2000s when we think about when all of these biofuels policies started to emerge. I mean, we saw it in the 1970s a bit, but really it started in the early 2000s and mid-2000s with the passage of the Energy Policy Act. With those of you that practice natural gas law, that was a cornerstone sort of law in incentivizing natural gas, but it was also key to incentivizing biofuels, and it established a blending mandate in the United States to blend certain amounts of ethanol into petroleum-based fuels. That mandate was increased in 2007 to 36 billion gallons of ethanol by 2020. And concurrently in Europe and other countries of the world, we saw a similar sort of increasing biofuels mandates, maybe in part in reaction to the September 11th terrorist attacks and this ideal of achieving energy independence. And also it really demonstrates the strength of the farm lobby as well. And we saw some of these incentives too, especially in the 2008 Farm Bill, make their way in terms of financing biorefineries and establishing payments to farmers for establishing perennial cropping systems. So you really saw this emergence, concurrently with natural gas emergence, in biofuels. But the key sort of year for those of us in law and policy in the biofuels world is 2008. Was a very transformative year for those of us, and it was really the first year of the Energy Biosciences came online right at the right time, or maybe the wrong time. Where we saw in 2008 we had food price spikes that people can debate about the causality between biofuels and food prices. There's a lot of debate about that, but at least in the media, it was the beginning of this food versus fuel argument. But maybe even more significant, which is not necessarily always in the news because it's kind of academic and wonky, is this study by Timothy Searchinger et al. He's currently at Princeton, but he's a Yale Law Review and former fellow at the Environmental Defense Fund, studied a paper that identified this concept of indirect effects and really argued that the cropping of biofuels, biomass for biofuels, displaces land in the United States that could be grown for food, sends a market signal to the international commodity market that, hey, food prices are going up. So a farmer in Brazil reacts to that price increase and clears more of the Amazonian rainforest. And thus, American biofuels, as he argues, should be assigned that additional indirect land use penalty, a greenhouse gas penalty, for deforestation in the Amazon. And so that got the whole sort of ball rolling, and one could argue that this was a ball that was really pre-planned by the environmental groups after we saw these sort of agreements about biofuels mandates. It really has put a stop to a lot of talk about the beneficial uses of biofuels. And we can talk a lot about those in the question and answer session as well. But so 2008 was that watershed year, and then by 2010, we had groups like the Nuffield Council in the UK, which is contains the most prestigious scientists in Great Britain, even going so far as to call biofuels unethical. And that unless we can ensure through biofuels policy that people are not starving in third world countries because of these food price spikes, that biofuels cannot go ahead based on this ethical argument. Then, as we know from last year, we had severe drought, and then again we had Hurricane Sandy and all these different storms. So no pun intended, but it became really, last year became the perfect storm for biofuels, and coupled with sort of uncertainty in Congress in terms of where they stand with our mandates, biofuels is really shouldering a lot of the intense debate about biofuels policy right now, about environmental policy right now, and land use. A lot of biofuels policies, I'm going to talk a bit about those, have shifted sort of in response to this sort of pushback against them, have said, well, we'll move to what is called marginal land. And you hear that so much in biofuels conversations and policymaking. So as a law professor, I wanted to sort of think about, and as a former practitioner, how do we operationalize a definition of marginal lands? And I have here that it includes marginal, idle, degraded, abandoned lands. And ask what that really means, because we toss it around a lot in policy discussions, but it really never makes its way into policy, and you'll see that. And I think the reason for that is that policymaking has been, up until now, really sort of ill-equipped in being able to do what we call multi-criteria optimization of all of the different complex decisions that go into land use, whether they're economic, whether they're environmental, whether they're social. They're very hard to pin down. So what I'm going to talk about today is a large part in that regard. So then you had to think about, well, how do we get better at that? And do we think about a more coordinated sort of way of policy making to police land use regulation and sort of mediate all of the resource demands that we have now in the world? So my presentation today is going to just look briefly at these marginal lands definitions that we have in bioenergy policies, or more rightfully said that we don't. Then I look at sort of broader environmental and socio-economic definitional sort of guidance in other laws that perhaps we, at least in the biofuels context, could borrow from, but we'll see that that's not so easy. And then lastly, I'll throw it out there, and not that I necessarily agree with this, that perhaps at the federal level, to sort of even the playing field, we'll need a little bit more coordination about how we use land in the United States so that biofuels doesn't have to sort of shoulder that whole burden of how we use land and whether it should go to marginal land and what that means. But maybe some of the constitutional hurdles in the way, so we'll talk a little bit about how the Obamacare case relates to biofuels, if you ever imagined that it could relate to that. Okay, so just some basic, I call them meat of land definitions, but marginal land definitions, and people use these very interchangeably, but marginal land typically is defined as it's not suitable for food production because of really it has poor soils or its propensity for erosion, it's very slopey. Idled land may be suitable for food production, but due to economic reasons, the land has been fallowed or idled. Degraded land typically is talked about in the context of contaminated land, so from an environmental perspective, there are substances in the soil that would inhibit any kind of agricultural crop growth. And then abandoned really incorporates all of the above, whether it's economic or whether it's environmental. Land can become abandoned for those reasons. So first, I just want to look at briefly the marginal lands definitions that you see in bioenergy policy in the United States, and really it's more about what you don't see, but yet we hear this in conversation a lot about biofuels need to be grown on marginal lands. So starting in 2005 in the Energy Policy Act, It called for an assessment of land resources to grow biofuels on. So even back then, this issue was a bit on the radar, but it focused on using residues and how to more manage land in an environmentally friendly way versus how to actually use land. Then, of course, federal law, you can't have a federal law without a prescription that the EPA and different agencies do reports. So in 2007, in the Energy Independence and Security Act, you have a mandate the National Academy of Sciences and that EPA in a triennial report, which came out 2 years ago, to address the environmental effects of biofuels policy, and including some of the social effects. So you have these reports that came out, in the last couple years that make references again to we need to grow biofuels on marginal lands, but they base most of their arguments of marginality on economic arguments about why you shouldn't grow crops there. They do talk about conversion of the reserve program, the conservation reserve program, and the danger of those lands being converted into biofuels cropping and attendant ecological damage. So you start to see these arguments, these economic arguments about using marginal lands counteracted with ecological damage arguments. And also a surprising, especially in the triennial report, argument that even if you use marginal land, you're going to have to use a lot of fertilizer, you're going to have to use a lot of water, and so the footprint of biofuels still does not win over the petroleum baseline. One of the biggest places where you see marginal lands policy working its way into biofuels is in modeling of greenhouse gas footprints in the renewable fuel standard at the federal level and in the low carbon fuel standard in California. And these economic models that folks where I'm at do, they try to model sort of indirect effects of biofuels cropping, that conversion that's going on in Brazil. So to the extent they say that biofuels can move to these marginal lands, you can prevent then food price spikes that cause the guy in Brazil to deforest. So if you sort of look under the covers of the economic modeling that's being done, you'll see that they really struggle. Even though they talk about marginal lands and how great it is to grow biofuels crops on them, you really see them struggle with the definition for it. They really just use CRP land and nothing but. And that's a little bit short-sighted. In the 2008 Farm Bill, and I don't know how many of you have heard of the Biomass Crop Assistance Program, those payments are going out to farmers in the hundreds, over $100 million of payments have went out for farmers to grow biofuels crops on land. There is no rule with BCAP that says that those crops have to be grown on marginal lands, except that they can't be grown on Conservation Reserve Program lands, Grassland Reserve Program lands. And they do have some conversion prohibitions in BCAP that you can't convert certain lands to biofuels. But you don't, again, you see in all of these federal laws, as much as we talk about growing biofuels on marginal lands, you don't see, as a lawyer would look at it, any sort of real legal definition of what does marginal land mean, how can I receive a BCAP payment, how can a refiner receive RFS credit for growing something on a marginal land, because in the law we really sort of insist on that and being able to verify that. At the state level, so that's at the federal level. You, as was mentioned here before, a lot of states have renewable portfolio standards for electricity generators to incorporate wind, solar, and also biomass into their co-firing. None of those renewable portfolio standards have a marginal land requirement that biomass only be grown on those lands. And actually you see most of the focus of debate in renewable portfolio standards really centering around the use of forests. So you see, for example, in Massachusetts, which really has the only sustainability standard for a renewable portfolio standard in the United States as of yet, California is getting one, you see that there's sort of the opposite of taking biomass from marginal lands, because Massachusetts says that you can't take this increased harvest for biomass that's pelletized into bioenergy, you can't take it from forests with already degraded soils. So that's sort of an inverse sort of marginal lands sort of argument for biofuels. In the European Union, they also, in their Renewable Energy Directive, which is their version of a mandate and low carbon fuel standard, where they do actually give a greenhouse gas credit for crops that are grown on degraded or highly contaminated lands, so they don't call them marginal lands. What they really mean by that are things like Superfund sites or land that is really not in the agricultural concept, but in other ways contaminated. There's no European-wide definition. There's been a real effort in Europe to define what land use categories are, like marginal lands or highly contaminated lands, but they've failed to have a European Union-wide soils directive. They have a water quality directive, or it used to be the nitrates directive. They have a biodiversity directive, but they can't get a soils directive there, which I think is indicative of worldwide the sort of debate about how land is used and soils connected to that land. So they rely on, like we would in the United States, all the different member state definitions of marginality or degraded or highly contaminated, and the member states have done all these studies, but there still is no codified definition of what marginal, idle, degraded, or contaminated land really means. In response to this food versus fuel pushback that the Europeans have really taken to heart, they proposed an amendment, I believe earlier this year or late last year, to step down dramatically the mandate in Europe for biofuels in this way, that it would cap the credit for fuel crops that you get for renewable energy counting. It would cap that at 5%. So any soy-based, any corn-based, capped at 5% per year for the member states. But then on the other hand, it double counts cellulosics. But the argument is that if you really want to address the indirect effects sort of question when it comes to food security, cellulosics and corn and soy are really equal because they all do take land unless they go to marginal lands. So you see in Europe that there's really no solution as well. Brazil has done something very interesting, and this is sort of what got me started, as we work a lot with Brazil at the Energy Biosciences Institute and their bioenergy policies. And in Brazil, they're able to do this because of their federal constitution, the laws that are promulgated pursuant to that the federal government there can do a land use zoning exercise at the federal level, and they've done this for biofuels, for sugarcane ethanol, and they do this for other things too in agriculture, where they do a zoning exercise. And it might be a little bit hard to see from the graphic, and I apologize for that. But the green areas that you see on the map are areas that the Brazilian federal government has said are suitable for sugarcane expansion. And where you don't see green, sugarcane croppers or people that own land in Brazil would not be able to, under law, to be able to plant sugarcane crops because of the concern in Brazil for deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions, but also the food security question. So Brazil, because the environmental spotlight is always on Brazil, especially with deforestation, Brazil was the first one out of the gate to really do this sort of land use zoning exercise. And it's really reverberated then internationally, because biofuels, unlike most other sort of commodity, especially agricultural commodity, is now subject, at least in the European Union, and will be in California shortly, to a set of sustainability standards. And among the sustainability standards that are being advocated for in private third-party standards that are driven by environmental groups like NRDC, National Wildlife Federation, one of those is the Roundtable for Sustainable Biofuels. And they've developed what's called an indirect impacts module, and it's caused a lot of controversy within the group in terms of whether this should be adopted or not. But this indirect impacts module proposes, and they'll propose this to the European Union model, that biofuels that are grown on marginal lands, whatever definition you can give that, and that's subject to the debate in this group, would be given some sort of extra credit under the mandate in Europe. What's the interesting part of this debate, and I'm a EBI representative to the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels. I represent EBI at the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard hearings, the Midwestern Aviation Sustainable Biofuels Initiative. I'm the chair of the Council for Sustainable Biomass Production, so I hear these arguments all the time, but the one that's interesting with the Roundtable for Sustainable Biofuels, which has, it's an international standard, and the UN is participating in this, as well as FAO and a lot of international organizations, but it has US government sort of representatives to it as well, that they started talking about, well, in what ways can we define these marginal lands that biofuels could get credit for growing them on? And they didn't turn to the typical what we do in the United States where we look at soils indices and things like that. They turned to a food and agricultural organization database that's called Net Primary Productivity, that's not just based on economics or soil quality, but it also is based on ecological values. So you're starting to see this way of interweaving these multiple sort of criteria into determining the definition of land. And it's not just an economic one, especially the people at RSB's opinion. It's also an ecological one and also a social one. Then you have what's called the Global Bioenergy Partnership, which is sponsored by the G20, and we have representatives from USDA there and all of the foreign nations in the G20 who are negotiating the sustainability of biofuels and what indicators for that should be. And part of that discussion, and they have these draft indicators out, or I think they call them final now, this group, which remember are G20 governments, came out with a set of indicators that said, well, we think that everyone that participates in biofuels production in the world and trades it on the world market should conduct this sort of zoning process like they did in Brazil and compare sort of land use impacts between biofuels or bioenergy and fossil fuels. And that immediately, as a lawyer in the United States, sort of perked my interest because under our sort of constitution, those sort of land use questions are typically state questions. But yet we have representatives from the federal government there sort of agreeing to these sort of indicators, and those discussions aren't open to people in academia or outsiders, so I'm not sure how that got in there, what sort of objections there were to that. But from a practical perspective, legally, that can be somewhat problematic in the United States. But the GBEP indicators are working their way into federal policy in terms of biofuels refiners and makers in the United States in terms of compliance with these indicators. So it's something to really look out for. Okay, so that's sort of the universe of how definitions of marginal lands are not considered in bioenergy policies, although we talk about marginal land all the time. So what I want to do then is turn to how to build this marginal lands definition. And again, that challenge is to identify and reconcile all the different economic, environmental, and social values that are inherent in land use. And there are a lot of studies out there about the economic reasons for why land becomes marginal or idled or abandoned. But there are very, very few studies out there about how ecological indicators or ecological factors sort of are present in these lands that we say biofuels can go to, and also socially how we as a culture use those lands and whether biofuels is the best, biomass cropping is the best use of that land. Okay, so first I looked to different idle lands programs because like I said, the BCAP and renewable fuel standards, they look at the CRP in terms of the definition of marginality. Being from Illinois, I looked at our laws, and we have two laws called the Save Topsoil and the Natural Resource Enhancement Program, and our farmers there get payments in return for granting the state conservation easements to their land to sort of protect what we would call marginal lands, mainly from a water quality perspective, but even there are no regulations to look at, there are no metrics on the website, so it's unclear how the state of Illinois decides how to fund these decisions about what lands are marginal and need to be protected, for example, for water quality or for habitat. CRP, of course, was first created as sort of an economic motivation to sort of keep commodity prices high, but eventually an environmental benefits index did work its way into the criteria for selecting CRP land. There's really a lot of question now, at least from the agricultural land grants, about, well, are we really achieving the environmental values that this environmental benefits index purports to sort of support? Are we really achieving that? And the answer is unclear, at least from an academic perspective. There are very few studies about whether we're getting the sort of bang for our buck for CRP lands and whether maybe we should consider growing biomass on those lands. But that's very controversial with environmentalists because we really lack tools for ecological assessment of what is happening on CRP lands. And that's not just at the site level or farmer level. It's also what now the environmental groups are pushing, and many academics are pushing, that we need to have assessments from a shed level. And you'll hear that a lot, I think, in the future, where assessments are not just farmer-specific or site-specific. We have to look at whether we're getting benefits for federal money from a shed perspective. So animals cross boundaries, birds cross boundaries, water crosses boundaries. So we can't just do individual assessments of farmers' lands. We need to do that in a more holistic. Turning from idle lands to contaminated lands. This is another place where, at least I know, environmental groups are really pushing the aviation industry, where biomass cropping needs to go. We have a ton of this land in the United States, and this is a conservative estimate that we have 16 million brownfield sites in the U.S. EPA has completed a Superfund study in Michigan where they took a very highly contaminated site that actually used to be a farm, but was a dumping ground for PCBs in the 1960s. And they did a study about growing corn and soy on that land for biofuels. I mean, you can't grow it for food, but you can grow it for biofuels. And they did find that there were equivalent yields, but that farmers would be very reluctant to go on those lands because if there's any type of post-activity contamination, under the law, there's a question about whether those agricultural biomass croppers would have shield from CERCLA liability, because CERCLA liability is strict liability. But there is the argument that if we could get that, it would free up some land, perhaps maybe not for even biomass. You could free it up for core development, so you didn't get the liability protection. You could still free that land up for core development and preserve agricultural lands, that valuable agricultural lands. And I come from Illinois, where there's a huge debate about how Chicago is encroaching on farmlands. Being able to preserve that agricultural land and sort of take some of the sting out of the food versus fuel debate. Pennsylvania has done some really interesting things with their mining, the reclamation sites, in terms of law and policy, where they allow for silviculturists who want to grow short rotation woody biomass or want to grow some type of biomass for bioenergy. And these are great sites for electricity generation because they're big, they're already sort of degraded, so they're thinking, why not put some bioenergy generation production on those sites and let these farmers grow trees, short rotation trees or biomass crops on those land, and in return, we'll give them some financial incentives and some early bond release from having to be responsible for what happens on those lands if there's some sort of reclamation liability. And Pennsylvania is the only state that has that. In terms of degraded lands, which are really the most difficult sort of definitional sort of way of thinking about things with biofuels on marginal lands, we do have something in USDA called the Land Evaluation and Site Assessment Program that guides farm preservation programs, because USDA is very active in trying to incentivize protection of core agricultural production lands. And it's a political process where you see this weighing of not only agricultural productivity, but you see some social indicators about farmers' way of lives working their way in there, and also scenic quality and wildlife habitat. So there is a bit of precedence, at least in USDA, for evaluating agricultural land from that multi-criteria perspective, not just soil quality. It hasn't been, at least the folks in Illinois around Chicago that farm would argue that it really hasn't been very successful because the incentive payment is not high enough to keep that agricultural land from going out of production permanently. But I think those people in my college that are biofuels advocates would argue that even if that land is not preserving for agricultural production because it's degraded, for example, then we need to consider in this political process whether or not we can grow biomass crops there, which really is not occurring but probably should. There are also what I've been talking about, these sort of cultural or social values and how they relate to land idling. And in the past, I think there's been a recognition that we've tried to put some lands completely off limits, like national parks or wilderness areas, while then we've let the sort of suburbs explode, and zoning has allowed for these 2 or to 5 acre lots and uses or idles a lot of land that could be used, for example, for food production or for biomass production. There's a movement now to sort of rethink zoning and rethinking whether or not we should set aside land for preservation. And you can look to the different regulations, for example, the National Park Service, when they manage those idled lands, or National Historic Preservation Sites. There is a public engagement process where the public can go in and talk about There's sort of value behind why a land should remain pristine versus why maybe it should be, we should rethink that and think about how we can grow food or other crops on those lands. One sort of interesting development from a sort of cultural value perspective is in Colorado, where their Department of Transportation in one of their regulatory documents recognizes that socially, at least in their state, they've recognized that climate change is real, and they have to start thinking about how to use lands more wisely. So they're doing currently a right-of-way study, and we're actually doing this in Illinois too, where we're looking at all of these lands that you see folks out there mowing every summer, whether those lands could be used more intensely for food or biomass crop productions. We also, at least in Illinois, are thinking about in Chicago this concept of new urbanism and how we can start growing more food on vertical surfaces of large buildings. It's really quite popular now with Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago. So, and that is sort of a zoning rethink in terms of we don't think about how we can grow crops on the facades of buildings. But that sort of tells you the intenseness of this debate on how in the future we're going to use land to be able to feed people. And folks in Chicago are quite concerned about where they're going to get their food from, let alone where they're going to get fuel if it comes from biomass. So it really does require a cultural rethink. The afternoon would not be complete, and maybe this is the fun stuff, without considering land use challenges in relation to federal law and sort of constitutionality. So this is the last third of my presentation, where I frame the sort of land use challenge in this way, is that the ecological and social and environmental values that are inherent in all land don't necessarily respect traditional local or state jurisdictional boundaries. They just don't, and there's growing science that says that water, biodiversity, people, they don't stay neatly within those lines, which in law we like to see because of our federal state system of government. So at least in my institute and a lot of these policy debates, we ask whether it's really reasonable for biomass to bioenergy policies to have to shoulder this balancing of food and fuel and feed and environmental needs for land that are mediated through an international market system for commodities that we really don't at a policy level have much control over, but dependent on local or state sort of zoning issues or zoning actions. You see that restricting biomass to marginal lands has really not had any effect on curtailing urban sprawl. That still continues today at a sort of alarming rate. We see that all of the yield increases that we've had in agriculture for commodity cropping haven't prevented conversion of valuable grasslands, and you see that particularly in South Dakota, where I'm originally from, or in North Dakota, where there was just a study that came out in Science, I believe from the South Dakota State, saying that grasslands have been converted at really alarming rates, and trying to sort of think about what has been the cause of that, and is it all biofuels, or is it corn cropping in general? Is it because of the way we eat? A lot of questions are starting to come out in terms of getting away from just arguing that yield is really our only solution. So my theory is that we really are going to, whether I like it or not, we're really going to have to start accounting for all of our land use decisions. And that is really coupled with, and I don't know how many of you have seen these reports come out recently from the CIA or the GAO or the Department of Defense. There's been one after another, it seems, in the past couple months, where they're really saying to society that we need to start planning for the risks and the great uncertainty that we will have from a national security perspective based on this on climate change and the uncertainty for food, feed, and fuel supplies that it will bring year to year because of droughts, because of flood, because of increased diseases among our agricultural crops. This is all going in writing at our federal agency levels, our national security agencies. You couple that sort of on the supply side of things with increased demand from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the population explosions that we're having, and it really looks like, and I don't want to say when or if it will ever occur, but if this was to occur, the question sort of theoretically arises is what would Congress do? What would the federal government do to sort of address massive food shortages or feed shortages if we had these droughts and we had China outbidding us or India outbidding us for those resources? So I sort of posed the question to myself and to you that what if Congress passed a law that implemented controls over what could be grown, where it could be grown on private land, and that owners would have to grow these crops or incur a tax? And so we just think worst case scenario, think that you're a DOD or CIA planner here, and we have sort of food shortages in the United States, and that this law, the motivation for it would be based on trying to figure out how to deal in policy with long-term subsistence needs and coupling that with ecological resilience of land. I thought about this in terms of the recent Obamacare decision by the Supreme Court because I was interested, at least generally, about knowing what Justice Roberts' opinion was on the Commerce Clause, but also, too, how that opinion would apply to that hypothetical where the federal government would try to zone or dictate how land is used. And remember, this is a conversation at the international level, at the G20 right now, about how the federal government should do the sort of land use zoning exercise. So the case that I typically call the Obamacare litigation is the National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius. And I think probably all of you know the background on that is where Congress mandated that everyone purchase health care insurance. And the reasoning for that was because if folks aren't purchasing health insurance, it has a substantial effect on interstate commerce, and that's one of our triggers for Congress to use Commerce Clause authority under the Article 1 of the Constitution, because it's shifting those costs to people who have insurance when people who are uninsured need health care. So the petitioners in this case, which were a group of states and other sort of healthcare businesses, sued the federal government, arguing that Congress cannot compel individuals to participate in commerce. And it's sort of the same sort of argument that we make in the biofuels food security context, that could the federal government compel landowners to participate in interstate commerce by producing food or feed or fuel? So Chief Justice Roberts concluded that, at least in the healthcare situation, that Congress didn't have Commerce Clause authority to compel economic activity from those who choose to not participate. And really significantly, he held that Commerce Clause authority reaches activity, not inactivity. And the fact that inactivity, and I work with a lot of economists who would disagree with Justice Roberts here, that the fact that inactivity has maybe some type of economic effect on the market that Congress seeks to regulate for whatever reason, say it's food security, doesn't trigger any type of federal authority under the Commerce Clause. He also didn't accept the argument that health insurance is unique, that the federal government made at oral arguments, that because it's unique and that people at some point in their life will need health care, with some exceptions, of course, but most people will need some type of health care along the way, and that it's really, this law is necessary to cover a set of universal risks that are common to all of us. He didn't accept that in terms of that triggering some type of activity. He thought the sort of temporal chain was too far, that a 22-year-old might not need health insurance until they're 98. And thus, that's not activity. That's inactivity, and the Commerce Clause cannot reach that. Justice Ginsburg authored the dissent in this case, and she noted that Justice Roberts' sort of view of economic inactivity versus activity really flies in the face of precedent that really since the 1930s New Deal was that the Supreme Court sort of took a hands-off sort of approach to Congress's sort of meddling in the economic affairs or the right to contract of private individuals. And that we're sort of going back to this sort of era like the Loeffner era or prior to the New Deal, where the Supreme Court was striking one law after another down, where Congress was trying to regulate for health and safety, for example, or wages or hours worked. She would instead adopt this economic-based approach that values effects of inactivity on the economy and interstate commerce as much as activity, because she argues that there's an effect either way. And she also believes that the government's argument that the healthcare market is unique and that at some point everyone is assured of participating and thus qualifies as some sort of activity. So if you apply this to the federalized land use scenario, I would argue that it would likely be constitutional only if the landowner was already participating in the economic activity of food production or feed production or producing something off the land. I think Justice Roberts would agree that that is a type of active activity that can be reached by the Commerce Clause. But say that landowner chose, if there was this land zoning exercise and there was this edict in the time of a food crisis that landowners had to produce certain things in certain ways at certain times for certain markets. Under Justice Roberts' ruling, I think that that would likely be unconstitutional if the landowner withdrew their land and said, rather than participating in this, I will choose not to produce anything from my land. I think Justice Ginsburg would argue that this withdrawal of land from the economic system has an economic effect from not participating in the market for food or for fuels, and thus would be reachable by the Commerce Clause, and that food production, like healthcare, is one of those things that is unique, that we all need food. It's universal to us for our survival, even maybe more so than healthcare. But perhaps the sort of saving part of this hypothetical would be that, remember, there was a tax attached to it if the person chose not to participate in this federalized land use exercise regime. And because there would be a tax attached to it if someone chose not to participate, like in the healthcare situation, under the Justice Roberts decision, he found ultimately that Obamacare was constitutional, not because of the Commerce Clause, but under the tax and spend provision, but only really as a saving sort of clause for the act, not because Justice Ginsburg had sort of asked him, well, why do you even need to reach the Commerce Clause issue if you can decide it on the tax issue? And he said that was really, the Commerce Clause analysis is absolutely necessary. You have to find that Congress doesn't have power under the Commerce Clause to be able to go to the taxation issue, because that's only sort of a saving part of the regulation. It can only be used to save it, not to completely support it. So in the scenario that I proposed, if there was a tax attached to it where someone failed to comply with how the federal government chose to zone land and uses of that land, if there was a tax, arguably under this decision, it would be constitutional. So this would be really the only way, I think, under this scenario for this sort of regime to work. So setting that aside then, another way of approaching at the federal level, federalized land use, would be through something that I didn't know exist until I started researching this paper, was hearkening back to 1970, where Congress actually did consider kind of this sort of scenario, but from an environmental perspective, not from a food security perspective. And there was a bill called the Land Use Policy Act of 1970. It didn't end up passing. But the bill called for the federal government, through their existing environmental laws and existing other laws, to more actively coordinate state and local action through those statutes. And this is at the time when the National Environmental Policy Act was enacted, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and some in Congress thought that this land use zoning law was really an important part of that whole regime of this new federal environmental regulation. It didn't pass, but now you see, fast forward to the 2010s, starting in 2008 when President Obama was elected, you see this same type of attitude, at least in environmental statutes, through President Obama's Clean Water Act strategies toward cleaning up non-point solution from agricultural entities. And you see it not in the Mississippi watershed. They've taken a different strategy there. They've taken a different one in Florida. But in the Chesapeake, because the Chesapeake is really specially singled out in the Clean Water Act, President Obama has taken this sort of strategy with the states within the Chesapeake Bay watershed that if states do not submit a management plan for how agricultural land is used, which is really zoning and sort of management prescriptions, if states don't submit a plan that U.S. EPA approves of, EPA will exercise what's called backstop authority, which means where they definitely have jurisdiction, because arguably, well, not arguably, they really don't in the Clean Water Act have jurisdiction over non-point source pollution from agriculture and land use, but they do certainly have jurisdiction over different discharges, say from a sewage treatment plant, from direct dischargers. The Obama administration says we're going to tighten the screws through what we call backstop authority. If you don't clean up agricultural pollution, we're going to tighten the screws on permits for your sewage treatment plants, which we have jurisdiction to do. So this is one example that I think the Obama administration would argue of the federal government trying to play a more sort of active role in coordinating, and this example is in a watershed, but coordinating how land is used to achieve, in this case, cleanup of nitrogen pollution and phosphorus pollution of the Chesapeake Bay. But by analogy, it could apply in sort of a broader context or a different environmental medium context. I don't know if under the Obamacare case or case law like New York versus U.S., that this would be held to be unduly coercive under the 10th Amendment, getting these states to do that. But there's litigation going on right now in the Middle District of Pennsylvania where the Farm Bureau and others plaintiffs are arguing that at the very least, this is contrary to the Clean Water Act, where most of, and I think they would argue this with all environmental statutes, that the authority is not there for EPA to be doing these sort of things in statutes. So it hasn't reached a constitutional argument yet, and they didn't plead that in that case. They didn't, in their pleadings, have the benefit of the Obamacare sort of decision from the Supreme Court. But I wouldn't be surprised down the road to see, because of that decision on the Medicaid provision of the Obamacare law, that courts would start citing the Obamacare the case for the premise that to be able to coordinate land use decisions from an environmental or social or even economic perspective, that it would be too coercive under the 10th Amendment, especially because zoning is the prerogative of states under the police power under the 10th Amendment. The last sort of thing, so we have the Obamacare litigation, we have the thinking about how the Obama administration is acting under environmental statutes. The last thing that I talked about in the paper for the law review is this concept of exercising emergency powers. Could the United States, if we have a food crisis that we've never seen before, could the president exercise emergency powers? And if you dig sort of deeply enough, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything, I'm an academic, but if you look to see what the federal government is doing in the international stage, you'll see that in response to the 2008 food price spikes and in response to the drought that we encountered last year, the United States is participating in these different international forums to try to build governance structures to be able to react to what could be a very volatile market for food. So, for example, in 2012, early 2012, they formed something called the Rapid Response Forum. And I quoted this from their materials, that it was formed to mobilize wide and rapid political support for appropriate policy responses in agricultural productions and markets at the international level, and that when something like this occurs, that there's a formal channel to have dialogue with the UN Committee on World Food Security. And this sort of makes the assumption that these food crises will only occur in places like Africa. But at least in the discussions that I participate in, there's also this concern that those food security crises could spread to places in the first world. So I looked at whether or what the rules were in terms of the president being able to exercise his power pursuant to a national emergency to be able to designate where food cropping or bioenergy cropping could actually go. And you really have to draw upon the preamble of the Constitution that provides for the common defense and welfare. This is where the president draws his or her power to sort of declare national emergencies. And you also have an act that's probably pretty unknown, an act that was passed by Congress in 1976 in response to a lot of the Roosevelt-era emergency orders never having lapsed. So they're really still on the books. They passed this law, first of all, to sort of say those are over, but also to say that if the president exercises emergency powers, that the president has to cite either constitutional authority for that or have a statutory basis for action. There is precedent from the New Deal era for declaration of emergencies to control means of production. That was done to achieve food security in the United States during the war. So at least it's worth from an academic exercise to think about, would this type of food crisis that we talk about a lot in biofuels policy and how biofuels is contributing to, would a food crisis qualify as a national emergency? Is that the way that the federal government would deal with the land use question about how we designate something as a marginal land over a productive land, over a place where we live, or a place where we produce fuel or natural gas, for example. So with that, I just wanted to say again, thank you for inviting me here, and that I think in relation to what has been spoken a lot about today, at least what I've heard in the natural gas context, that although I'm sort of biofuels centric from where I'm coming from, that all types of energy, and petroleum included, are not immune to this land use question and how these sectors are using land and how governments, and arguably the federal government, because arguments are being made right now that the federal government should think about this, how the federal government will go about figuring out how land should be used if we start having food scarcity, water scarcity, ecosystem collapse. These aren't sort of discussions that are just had in sort of fringe and blogs on the internet. These are questions that in biofuels policy, which is amazing to me, we actually talk about. And so I think it would behoove all of us who support energy, whatever energy that is, to think about how, from a lawyer's perspective, from a policy perspective, how we can start maybe to use land more wisely, either to avoid these sort of situations or think about if these situations occur, how in law and policy we're going to have to deal with that. So with that, thank you again for having me, and I really enjoyed being here. And I'd be happy to talk biofuels, because I know that we have some.
Do we have any questions?
I'm happy to take questions or have a discussion. This isn't the first time. I'm glad I at least stirred the pot. And I think, and I don't agree or disagree, but I do tell my students that we can be angry about this. We can, resist, and that's helpful, I think, too, at least from a gut reaction sort of perspective. But we have countries like India and Brazil and China who, regardless of what we do or say here, will formulate their own policies. And so in order to, I tell my students to sort of think pragmatically and how we can have constructive dialogues to avoid all of this. Because if we shut down and just say, we're Americans, we're not going to talk about this, and I get that. I was raised in South Dakota. The conversation will still continue without us. And so I think we have to engage. And how we engage is sort of up to us. And that's an interesting comment, because I do deal with Brazilians on ethanol policy, and you raise the issue of, for example, E15 and blending. And when you have this conversation with Brazilians, they'll say to me, well, we solved the problem, and as an American in the room hearing that, I kind of think, well, why didn't we solve that problem? Because in Brazil, they have entirely an ethanol-based system, and they still have boats, and they still have lawnmowers, and they have cars. So from a sort of patriotic sort of perspective, I think that we need to maybe have a dialogue where we look at what other countries are doing, and if they solve the problem, then more power to them. Let's learn from that.
Is this like a takeoff from the CSP program for the enhancement of the land?
The Conservation Stewardship Program?
Yes.
At least that's really not really being advanced by USDA in terms of how we apply those set of standards to biomass cropping or really even commodity cropping, because the program is so sort of underfunded and sort of piecemeal. But I think it's worth talking about, and I didn't mention CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, which pays for farmers to install some of these environmental amenities. But I think that too, in addition to biofuels, we should have a conversation about how maybe that's one way that we can think about how to use land, because it is a set of metrics.
I think what I hear you saying is that, I hear two things. I mean, I have some problems with ethanol and the cost that it's caused us, but you have, through your academic studies and your efforts in this area, you've found a country, Brazil, who's actually taken biomass and made it really a positive fuel that is actually the predominant fuel in the country that's actually superior to petroleum. Is that true?
This is not without Brazil having to control the cost of petroleum to make sure that ethanol remains competitive with it. But I think this goes back to the 1970s, and I mentioned to my Brazilian colleagues that they did have a dictatorship during the 1970s where they put all of these different blending and flex fuel mandates for cars in place. But what had to accompany that was an effort to keep petroleum prices high. And the Brazilian government has incurred a significant liability monetarily for having to do that. So it's not a perfect solution, and gas prices are now going to go up in Brazil because of the sort of decline in ethanol production there. But it's a decision not just based on economics of the gas pump. It's based on sort of a patriotic energy security argument, and also their belief in climate change and that biofuels are a better way to solve that problem than petroleum fuels. But it's not as perfect as maybe it's made out to be.
And I, for one, in hearing your presentation, although I'm not, well, just say this, I think that we definitely need people with your insight and effort and academic training to continue to see if we can broaden ourselves and not be totally dependent on petroleum. We claim as a nation we want to be petroleum independent, and yet we have people like the gentleman that had to leave early.
I chased him away.
Yeah, well, I think he needed that moving bar to Dixon. But you know, you're going to take that kind of heat, but you have the courage to continue to push us forward as an American. He's proud of America, as we all are, and maybe we need to learn from the Brazilians and lead the world. Maybe we can be second and still lead the world. You know, maybe we need to take those. And I would like to see more. And I'm really intensely interested in this and the issue of property that's, quote, unsuitable for agriculture and utilizing that more. And that seems an area that you're grabbing onto and that we haven't as a country developed with. I would, you know, of course.
Yeah, we're really grappling with that question. And I didn't pull the graphic up, but there's a recent Nature article by the folks it's a DOE-funded Great Lakes Bioenergy Consortium at Michigan State, where they did a study just based on greenhouse gas emissions of where marginal lands could be used for cellulosic crops. And I wish I should have. I didn't get time to do it. But if I could pull up the state of North Dakota, the darkest green, the greatest potential is here going west in southwestern North Dakota.
There you have it.
So to the extent that academics can lend sort of credence to what sort of benefits are we really getting out of this land, and one reason why I hesitate to put those graphics up, because it was only greenhouse gas centric. It wasn't what the environmentalists would argue, well, what if there's a rare species that's using that land and people are going to go in and biocrop it? We just don't know. I don't agree or disagree. We just don't know because we don't have funding in the United States academically to be able to go out and study those lands because they're marginal to begin with. And I'm from South Dakota, and people would say, oh, there's nothing valuable out there. It's really ugly. But it's actually really beautiful. It's really useful. It's culturally significant. It has ecological significance. But we don't have the funding to look at that. At least my institute, we're starting to do that. But it's going to take a lot of funding for us to do the type of assessments that are actually already being done in Brazil. They're already being done in Europe. China's starting to do them. And then environmentalists can't say that, well, there might be something there. And they take advantage of that uncertainty.
Thank you.
Thank you.